L'Histoire du Toronto Centre. Now, to get our program underway, let me briefly introduce your MC and Toronto Centre CEO, Babak Abbasadeh. Permettez-moi maintenant de dire quelques mots au sujet de votre animateur, M. Babak Abbasadeh. Babak a été nommé président-directeur général du Toronto Centre en juin 2010. Il possède près de 30 ans d'expérience en politique gouvernementale et en matière d'engagement des parties prenantes au sein du secteur privé, des agences publiques et des ONG axées sur les services financiers, l'énergie et les ressources naturelles. Avant d'occuper cette fonction au Toronto Centre, Babak a détenu divers postes de leadership à l'Office d'investissement du RPC et chez la financière Sun Life. Il a aussi été chef de cabinet pour 2 ministres provinciaux influents. Je vous présente, please welcome, Babak Abbasadeh.
Thank you, Sylvie. Thanks, everyone. Governors, distinguished guests. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs et distingués invités. Bienvenue à la causerie sur le développement durable et la finance présentée par le Toronto Centre. Toronto Centre believes that for countries to thrive, their financial systems must be stable and inclusive, as you saw in the video. In turn, these stable and inclusive economic growth opportunities positively contribute to poverty reduction, as confirmed by the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I'd like to pick on one of the 17 SDGs. The UN SDG 5 is concerned with achieving gender equality and empowering women and girls. This is also the focal point of Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. How is this relevant to financial sector supervisors, regulators, and the mission of the Toronto Centre, you might ask? De 1 milliard de femmes, surtout dans les pays en voie de développement, qui n'ont pas accès aux services financiers de base. So how do we deal with the 2 billion women who really don't have 1 billion women who don't have access to financial services? We believe in developing countries, inclusive financial systems are a powerful instrument for women's empowerment. Women's ability to save, borrow, and control their own money and to insure themselves and their assets reduces poverty and promotes inclusive growth. Innovations such as digital finance expand financial services to poor and rural women. By supporting authorities' efforts to put in place regulatory and supervisory frameworks that promote sustainable growth and ensure consumer protection, our programs help reduce the gap in women's usage of financial services. So as you've seen in the video, not only do our programs prepare countries and authorities, whether they're central banks, supervisory authorities, for the next inevitable financial crises and help them combat money laundering and improve their capacity in risk-based supervision, but also our work is relevant to closing the gender gap in finance, combating climate change, promoting good governance, and other parts of the Sustainable Development Consensus globally. At this point, I'd like to recognize if a few people, our board of directors are here, but also John Palmer and Deja Horvath, who were our founders, really, in this room. So they played a major contribution. And thank you for being here. And now, before we begin the fireside chat, I would like to ask our new chairman, Governor Stefan Ingves, who became the chair in July, to come and say a few words. Governor Ingves is the governor of the Central Bank of Sweden, the chair of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and involved in many activities in the European Financial Stability Theater. He's also been a member of the Toronto Centre's board of directors since 1999. So he's a very humble and modest man, but he strides the globe like a giant. So, Governor, please.
Well, thank you, Babak, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you this evening. And I'm particularly pleased also to participate in this forum with my fellow alumnus of the Bretton Woods institutions. Bertrand Badré, along with Elissa Golberg from Global Affairs Canada. In fact, it was actually during my time as the director of the Monetary and Financial Systems Department at the IMF that I first became engaged with the Toronto Centre as a member of the board. Back then, I was compelled by the Centre's mission and work, and I feel to be honored to hold the position of chairman now, because that makes it possible to continue contribute to the work of the Toronto Centre. Now, I also recognize the challenge I face living up to the standards set by my predecessor, John Palmer, the former superintendent of financial institutions here in Canada. The Toronto Centre actually owes John a lot. Now, I look forward working together with Maureen and the rest of the board, as well as with the Centre's management team and staff led by Babak. And let me say that for those of you who have not seen the Toronto Centre in operation from within, it is a wonderful small shop doing good. At first, of course, it might seem odd for a Swede like myself to be chosen to serve as chair of the Toronto Centre, but think about it. Swedes and Canadians have quite a lot in common. There are some striking similarities between our countries. We have global reputation for a good progressive government. We have vast open landscapes. We have the same harsh winters, darkness in the winter season, and on the other hand, we have very long evenings in the summer. And despite ongoing challenges in different parts of the world, we each have strong economies and some of the highest standards of living in the world. And in addition to that, both of us are living near powerful superpowers. Now, maybe it's because of this, both our nations have developed a natural, fierce sense of self-reliance, but a self-reliance that is also strongly tempered by caring for our communities and caring for the vulnerable. We also both have robust international development assistance programs which focus on such progressive issues as gender equality and combating the adverse impact of climate change. And while we are not perfect, by any means not perfect when it comes to finance, we understand the importance of fostering effective institutions and frameworks for good governance and regulation of financial institutions. Now, particularly when you consider Toronto Centre's nowadays vast global reach and its cross-sectoral engagement in banking, securities, insurance, and pensions, I trust that you will appreciate the relevance of an international perspective based on shared values in its governance. Now, there's a shared vision in Sweden and Canada, and also this, I think, holds for the Basel Committee, and all of this regarding the importance of sound financial sector supervision around the world and its contribution to financial stability and financial inclusion. Now, since the time of the global financial crisis, much effort has been devoted to improving regulation and supervision, and Toronto Centre over these years has made an important contribution to that effort. But at the same time, I think we all also need to recognize that financial stability, while of course necessary, is not really sufficient in a world facing many daunting challenges of poverty, inequality, and climate change, just to name a few. So I'm sure that Bertrand and Elissa will cite the importance of the internationally agreed UN Sustainable Development Goals in setting out the nature of the required responses to these challenges. I suspect that they will also actually make clear that the implementation of those goals will depend on financing at a level that far outstrips the resources of governments and the official multilateral institutions. At the end of the day, the resources will also have to come in one form or the other from the private financial sector. And I do hope that eventually the private sector will rise to the occasion, and this will also be discussed this evening. And in closing, let me offer a special thanks to the Government of Canada, who is playing an important leadership role in responding to the challenges I just mentioned. And imperatively for us at the Toronto Centre, the Government of Canada is generously sponsoring Toronto Centre to enable it to continue to make its important contributions along the lines of the government's efforts. Thank you.
Thanks, Stéphane. Thanks, Governor. Thanks for energizing, warming up the crowd. Now I'd like to ask both our featured speaker, Bertrand, and Elissa Golberg to please come forward. I just want to talk about a couple of housekeeping rules. To avoid long speeches, we've asked them to conduct a session kind of like a World Economic Forum, questions that will be posed to Bertrand and answers, and of course there's going to be plenty of opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Please take advantage of this opportunity and ask these questions. And they really don't need a lot of introduction, and you have seen their bios before. Bertrand was a former managing director and CEO of the World Bank Group, so it's a pretty impressive role. And also is the founder and CEO of Blue Like Orange, a sustainable development organization. And Elissa is also a very prominent senior executive of Global Affairs Canada, Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for strategic planning, with some incredible postings around the world as an ambassador to Geneva, to disarmament, and also in Afghanistan, also she played a role there. So without further ado, Elissa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. You're quite right. We are going to touch on the Sustainable Development Goals. We are going to talk about innovative financing for development. Mais tout d'abord, je suis vraiment ravie de soyez parmi nous aujourd'hui et ce soir avec mon grand ami Bertrand. Congratulations to the Toronto Centre on your 20th anniversary of work. I think organizing tonight's discussion on such a timely and important theme underscores your value proposition. This issue that we're going to talk about tonight, blended finance, the role of the private sector, changing the way that the international financial institutions are investing in sustainable development, is one of the hot subjects that we've been discussing within our community over the course of the last few years. But it's one where we're all struggling a little bit in terms of determining how best to land. How will we make sure that these kinds of investments where the public sector is acting as a risk enabler, whether or not that is going to result in better development outcomes than if we would have just done normal traditional development assistance, for instance. Are we really attracting additional new partnerships and capital? These are some of the things that we're struggling with and something that Bertrand has been thinking a lot about. Contrairement que des fois il a l'air, je sais que Bertrand est optimiste. C'est quelqu'un qui travaille franchement sans relâche à repenser comment la finance peut soutenir le développement durable et comment est-ce que la finance internationale pourrait être avantageux pour tout le monde. Bertrand avait dit l'argent est une excellente serviteur, mais une mauvaise maître. J'avais dit qu'il est vraiment optimiste. Bertrand, you've also said that after the world's kind of initial enthusiasm with the Sustainable Development Goals, with ADIS, with the Paris Agreement, and all of the work that we've done around financing for development, that momentum is fading. You've expressed concern that poorly designed and poorly governed public-private initiatives have stalled, and you've talked about the importance of making sure that if we don't structure these kinds of investments and get the architecture right, that we're setting ourselves up for a disaster. Now, this is something certainly that is a view we share, as you know, and we've spent a lot of time trying to think about, okay, well then, how best do we approach this particular situation? And it's interesting because in the Canadian context, and this I lay by way of just kind of general context, it's a view that actually is shared across the political spectrum. And that, I think, has been particularly helpful as Canada navigates this space. This was evident, for instance, in the all-party support that was received for Canada's new DFI. When we were standing up FinDev, it had support across the spectrum, and it also spanned 2 successive governments. The previous government launched Convergence, which is an incredibly important online platform to enable blended finance deals, for instance. The current government has taken investments further, including in the last budget, where it announced about $900 million for new innovative financing mechanisms. So there is a strong commitment that is being brought forward. As was mentioned, we're also looking at how, with these new innovative financing instruments, do we make sure that they're gender sensitive? That's also a whole new domain that hasn't been given a great deal of attention in the past. But as we're pursuing these things, I think none of us is naive that it's going to be easy. In terms, in particular, of attracting private investors, whether that is the pension funds, whether it's impact investors, whether it's others, their appreciation for what we understand to mean frontier markets isn't necessarily the same. And this has been a bit of a journey with that community to figure out how best do we collaborate together to increase the opportunities for partnership and to increase the likelihood that we're going to see additionality in this space, which is so vital at this moment in time. So how do we get evidence-based? How do we, what kind of catalytic tools do we need to be looking for? This is something that I'm hoping that tonight we'll be able to pick the brain of one of our foremost gurus on the subject, and I'm hoping that it's a conversation then that we can open it up to the room and also benefit from your ideas. This is a room full of people who've been thinking hard about these issues. Alors Bertrand, je commencerai par demander, you've said that public policy can't tell the private sector where and how to allocate its money. Short-termism is rampant, change and uncertainty is the norm, but at the same time, we're looking ahead. We see the millennials are about to inherit trillions of dollars. There's an opportunity there because they're saying that they care about sustainability and investments in the sustainable impact space. So as governments, how should we look at potentially influencing, on the one hand, private investors, as well as the private sector, to engage in the sustainability space?
Well, I think you've touched on a number of essential topics. Let me take a step back. First of all, happy birthday to the center. We've celebrated the 100th anniversary of the armistice, the 10th anniversary of Lehman bankruptcy. The true real birthday is yours. So I really wanted to start with this. And in a way, these birthdays are somewhat connected. And I don't want to make this too artificial, but I think it's important to take a step back. Again, the past 100 years, they started pretty poorly in 1918. It's been said and repeated over the past few days. In 1944, 1945, we take a second chance, which kind of worked until it stopped working in the 70s. Then under, again, the influence of, in particular, Thatcher and Reagan, we enter this neoliberal cycle, which basically was okay until it was not okay anymore. And now, after the so-called global financial crisis, we are still navigating the exit. So on the one hand, the good news, and kudos to Stéphane and the Basel Committee, we are still alive. We have not collapsed. We have avoided most of the mistakes of the 1930s. And again, I was not so sure when I woke up on the 15th of September 2008 with the balance sheet of Crédit Agricole, 2 trillion on my shoulders, that I would be okay, but we're okay. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is, there is an old saying, we say, never waste a good crisis. And I'm wondering whether we have not wasted that crisis. And basically address the real issues that really were the origin of the crisis. So I was kind of very optimistic in 2015 when we had these sequences agreeing on the Sustainable Development Goals, agreeing on climate, agreeing on development finance, etc. I say, okay, we've defined the roadmap. And at that time, when I was at the World Bank, I led this report called From Billions to Trillions, which is exactly the problem of scales. On the one hand, you have a global economy of, depending on how you measure it, between 80 and $100 trillion. On the other hand, public money, depending on whether you count the ODA or the combined commitment of the World Bank, the IMF, the EIB, and so on and so forth, is 150, 200 billion. So you have a massive gap between public money available and the needs. But I genuinely thought that this would be solved and that we will find a way to mobilize. And the truth, 3 years later, more and more people realize that we are off track or off chart and that the system itself has not changed. So coming back to your question, I do believe market economy is still the right way to allocate our resources and make sure that the money goes where it's most needed. But market economy doesn't work alone. So you need on the one hand to have the appropriate regulatory framework or legal framework or whatever, saying this is what you should do, this is what you cannot do, this is what you incentivize you to do. And on the other hand, you need to find incentives within the market. What do clients want? So shall we just wait for the millennials to be wiser than we are and say, okay, they will inherit the money, we have not been able to use the money well, it's going to be great when my kids take over. I hear that. We can't be passive like this. So how do you remind people that, and the money of whatever, BlackRock or whoever, is not BlackRock's money, it's my money. It's my pension, it's my savings, etc. So what do I want to do with my money, and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, very important. So we have to play on both sides, educate the people, make sure they understand what is at stake, and also make sure the framework is okay. And I think we must recognize today, and again, it took me a while to get there. I've been part of the system for this past 25 years, mostly at the World Bank. I spent most of my time actually in the private sector. I think we have a system which is even not neutral between long-term and short-term. I think we have a system where short-termism is embedded in the system. It's not just a quarterly report. I mean, I've been CFO of listed banks. Every quarter, I had to prepare my accounts to make sure they look as good as possible, and it's okay. But it's more than that. It's the accounting system. Again, remember, at the basis of depending whether you use a US GAAP or IFRS, it doesn't really matter, you have the mark-to-market approach, which means that every quarter you have, even if you don't think about it, you have a liquidative approach in your mind. How do you want to think 20 years down the road when every quarter you have to have this liquidative approach? It goes beyond just trying to insert a carbon pricing, etc. It's way more than that. The compensation system, the bonus, I mean, even if there have been changes, is still the annual yardstick, and so on. And even for regulation, I mean, I've discussed with insurance companies, and they say Solvency II, my horizon is still, the biggest horizon is still 1 year, not 20 years. And you can take this one by one. So on the one hand, I think we have reassured, to a certain extent, financial stability. On the other hand, so we have prevented, I mean, the financial system to collapse. And again, it's good. Again, it's very good that we are here alive tonight. On the other hand, we have not really prepared for what comes next. And now we are starting to worry for the next financial crisis. And people say, oh, it might come next year, in 2 years, in 3 years. I don't know. So people are now really obsessed with the financial crisis. How are we well equipped, etc. Nervous that international coordination is likely to be more challenging next time compared to last time. But my problem is that besides this financial crisis, we are not really prepared to address the climate crisis, and probably even worse, the popular anger crisis. So we are at this juncture where, again, for many, many years, I thought I was an incrementalist. Let's change things step by step. I think now we have to make a revolution. We have to really to address the heart of the system. And for me, even to recognize that, it took me 10 years to get there. But I think now we really have to do that. We cannot be blind. So we can be very happy that there are more green bonds, there are more social bonds. We have a lot of people saying, yeah, I'm going to finance these great things, etc. But it's not enough. And first of all, we don't really know whether what they say is true or not, because you have a lot of announcements, etc. And in reality, I would not denounce one of your colleagues from central banks, but a high guy at the ECB told me we should create the Greenpeace of finance to make sure that everything these banks say is verifiable. So we are at this point where I don't want to create expectations with the people, and then people say, oh my God, you told me that and you've done again something different, and now you want me to bail you out again. So that's really this precise moment where I'm still optimistic because of the millennials, because there is so much money available, because of the technology, etc. But on the other hand, we have not changed from within the incentives in the financial system to get there.
So then,
and that's really what worries me.
Well, let's talk about the incentives, because who's responsible for setting the incentives, and what should they look like? So, for instance, an organization like ours is interested in identifying ways to unlock new capital for investments in climate-smart infrastructure, for instance. And so we recognize that we need to go beyond traditional grants and contributions. And so we're looking at guarantees and we're looking at equities. So we will provide the kind of upfront risk capital. Is that a sufficient incentive? Is that the right kind of incentive? And who needs to be incentivized?
No, I think, again, everything which is happening is important. I mean, remember, I discussed actually with Mark Carney in Lima in 2015 what we call the silent revolution in finance. And we were listing the 400 or 500 initiatives, public, private, changing finance. And we say this silent revolution will become a very vocal revolution. Well, 3 years down the road, I think it's still pretty silent, a little less, and still not a revolution. So again, I don't want to be negative. A number of things are happening, and it's great. And I will comment what Canada is doing. You're really on the front line of all this.
Show us a little more love, Bertrand.
Sorry?
So you have to show us more love.
No, but again, all this is absolutely important. My point is that it remains marginal. It remains marginal. Again, we will do a lot of good things, but it's still small. I mean, remember, we are in a $100 trillion economy. The fixed income market is probably 150 to 200 trillion. So 200 or 300 billion green bonds is a lot from one perspective, but not a lot compared to the needs and so on and so forth. So the point is, as I said, market economy at the end of the day will address the issue, but we have to make sure that let me take you a very interesting example, just to show when things are well-intentioned and they hit something which is not good. So, and again, I pushed for that. So the IFC, the private arm of the World Bank, put together a green bond fund with Amundi, with the asset management arm of Crédit Agricole. And I mean, actually, both are my babies because I structured the deal creating Amundi, and I worked with the World Bank to push for this type of thing. And the World Bank is offering a first loss protection on this green bond. And then Crédit Agricole went to discuss with an insurance company, and the insurance company is very attractive, you know, you are protected by the World Bank, first loss, etc. But from a Solvency II capital, it's worse because it's considered a structured product, and because it's a structured product, the capital charge is higher. So again, it's anecdotal. At the end of the day, but you have plenty of these little things everywhere. I have a long list of these things. So the fact is that we have been rightly so preoccupied by financial stability, but now it's time to be preoccupied by what comes around this and make sure that the entire regulatory framework is not against or opposed or biased vis-à-vis the needs that we are facing. That's on the one hand. On the other, it's not just purely regulatory. We should not fool ourselves. Regulation is very important. Supervision is important. It's not enough. This is a foundation. And that's where I come to the point on educating people. What do I want to do with my money? It's my money, and I want my money to finance my values. And again, most people say, my God, I mean, these big pension funds, it's too big for me. You feel, I mean, it's not within my reach. So you have to really empower people to make sure they push for a good use of their money, etc. So again, I don't know, there might be a tipping point where your initiative or the initiative might create something bigger. I don't think we're there yet. And I think, again, the basic incentive framework within the financial system has not been really changed. And again, it's not just the compensation, it's the whole thing.
So if you were, and you are, because there's people in this room that will influence those discussions, heading to the G20 or even the G7. So the G7 has recently made a commitment to financing for sustainable development. So it's at least trying to address that education component of it, not necessarily the regulatory angle. At the same time, we're trying to crowd in the pension funds who are doing some initiatives and starting to get into the game. What would you want to see the G20, for instance, doing in this space? If we're really talking about leapfrogging, if you really want to unlock the game-changing capital that you're talking about and really changing the system and blowing it up, what would your expectations be for the G20?
Well, it's not totally theoretical, because I'm lucky enough to have known Emmanuel Macron for a long while. He was kind enough, actually, which was an exception for a president, to sign the foreword of the book, highlighting that we need to put finance as a service of environment and development, which is a strong statement for a president. The big issue is that I know what I would like to do. I mean, basically, when you take the G7 or G20, you have everybody around the table. So if you agree that this is the right thing to do, normally you should be able to do that. The problem is that, if I can be a little bit provocative, it's not because you put 7 or 20 leaders in a room that you create leadership. So how do you get there? And I've discussed that with President Macron. The problem is that in today's world, to get some form of minimal consensus of these ideas is not within reach. That's really, I hope I'm wrong. But I don't see the people gathering in Argentina in a few weeks or in France next year. I hope. I mean, again, I'm working with a team in Paris, etc., to make it work. The problem is that we have these kind of bigger forces behind us, which basically are, maybe, I hope I'm wrong, risk tearing apart the multilateral framework in which we are operating today. And that's really, that's part of my pessimistic view on things. So again, I think we have everything again, the people around the table, we've got everything. They've got the money, they've got the capacity to influence, you can change the regulation, etc. That is here. How do we get there? I don't know. That's really, I was much more optimistic.
We're kind of looking to you to give us some answers.
No, but again.
The whole I don't know.
No, but you know, I'm ashamed to be like this, because I was much more vocal and positive a year ago. But the more I meet with people and talk to people, the more difficult I think. I really believe that the real underlying strength that might change this is really what the millennials or the younger people are willing. My anxiety is that I don't want this to be broken before they take over.
No, fair enough. I have to say, I'm in a more optimistic space than you are at the moment, because I'm starting to see new voices at the table that we haven't before. And I think those voices are also pushing some of the governments to take some of the decisions that need to be taken. So, I had a meeting last week with HSBC in London and their sustainability focal point. And they've made a choice as an organization that they will no longer be investing in coal-related activities, and they're shifting predominantly towards renewables. For an organization like that, it sends a very interesting message to capital markets. UBS, similarly, is having a whole series of interesting conversations, irrespective of your UBS, really interesting conversations with their private wealth capital. In the Canadian context, we have 8 of the top 25 ESG-related pension funds, or ESG compliant, are our pension funds, and who are now kind of engaging in the space. So there is this momentum building amongst those players that's reverberating back to governments who are now starting to have these conversations. So in Charlevoix, we did have this declaration on sustainable finance and an interesting conversation. Prior to that, there was, for the first time ever, finance and development ministers met together to have a conversation, each coming at it from their unique vantage point. So these are conversations and actors that haven't been necessarily intersecting with each other before around discussions like climate financing or infrastructure. Fair point about whether the scale is sufficient.
No, but again, I think this was one of the important lessons of COP21. COP21 was, of course, a success of French diplomacy. But I don't think it would have been possible without the push from the private sector, from the NGO, etc., which actually is a strong push, made the failure so costly that you couldn't really miss it. So I think it's very interesting. My problem, coming back to the point, I will not deny the efforts of HSBC or others, but it relies more on CEOs, individual CEOs making the decision to move their organization. It's not part of the system. It's not part of the system yet. And again, so it's great. And again, I don't want to sound negative on that. And I hope the more organizations go into that direction, the better, definitely. And the more government do what you do, the better. And I hope at some stage you create a critical mass so that you pass a tipping point and you move. But my concern is, again, maybe I spend too much time in finance, and I know that, I mean, things can change. Again, if we have a financial crisis in 1, 2, or 3 years, I hope these efforts will survive. And again, that's why it's really embedding this in the system that is important. Make sure that it's really great for these people to do the right thing, not just because the CEO thinks it's the right thing.
No, and
So
that's
again,
fair enough.
it's moving. And we have to encourage all of this, definitely.
So activist investors,
Yeah.
shareholders
Yeah.
have to be in their face.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
role there for government, then for public education, but
Yeah.
also for civil society organizations to be doing civic engagement and public engagement.
Yeah, and again, look what can be done from a regulatory perspective. It's not just about cleaning the kind of stupid things I mentioned before, but make sure that now we have, I think, kind of guaranteed the solidity of the system. What can we do to move the system in the right direction, to value these efforts, etc. And the other point is, again, is interesting. Now I'm on my own. I've created this investment fund called Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. It's going to be the opening of the commercial page, so we'll close soon. So now I'm really promoting my fund. So I'm knocking on the door. So because of my background, I got meetings everywhere, so I can meet with the people. The reality is that people are still very nervous. I remember when I presented my book in France a few months ago, Martin Wall from the Financial Times was kind enough to come on stage, and he told the people, you can be risk adverse 1 year, 2 years, but not 5 or 10 years. This is very bad. And the problem is that the financial system is still very risk adverse for good and bad reasons. First, because they still have the memory of the crisis. And second, because as part of the changes that have happened in the past few years, the risk groups have been elevated in the governance, so they have a much bigger say, which might be from financial stability a positive, but basically it creates a risk aversion climate in the organization. And second, compliance has been elevated. And so when I speak to people which are convinced, yes, what you do is great, etc., but then they say, oh my God, I have to discuss with the risk, with compliance. And so that's what I call the non-incentive. You really have to have people which are passionate about this to be willing to move the organization. As again, two of the CEO of the large French insurance company told me, when you're AXA, for instance, or CNP or as well, every month you're buying billions of euro, yen, Swiss franc, or whatever of zero rate bonds, or even negative. Because it's the right thing to do. I mean, you do that. And bottom line, it's not a great service for the issuer, because with cheap money, they have no incentive to make a reform. It's bad for the insured person. So life insurance in France yielded 5% 10 years ago. Now it's less than 1%. And same for pension funds. And it doesn't really help the world. Whereas if part of this money was channeled towards energy in Africa, agriculture in Latin America, or also education in South Asia, this would be great for this country, probably great for the pensioners and for the people putting their savings in life insurance, and great for the world. The problem is that the system is scared. And the system is really blocked on this, and we have not really changed. So the big issue is that, on the one hand, it's great that the Dutch pension funds say, yes, we want to move to sustainable investment. But again, when sustainable investment means financing the Dutch waterways, okay, it's great, but it doesn't really help the world. So I'm a little provocative. It's more complex than that.
No, but it's a great...
But the point is, there is a specific issue for emerging and developing economies, where the needs are the greatest. You will always be able to finance good things in Canada, France, or Netherlands. At the end of the day, you'll find a way. The problem is how you channel the money where it's most needed, which is in this country.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the big debate right now in terms of being able to attract this additional investment.
Yeah.
How do we say to impact investors and to pension funds, for instance, what you understand to be a frontier market is maybe not what, as a development practitioner, one would see as a frontier market. I want you in Mali, not necessarily only in South Africa or Colombia. And so how does that happen? that's an ongoing conversation. Part of it is about helping them to understand what the real risks are as opposed to the perceived risks, and they're not necessarily the same. But it's a good question then to say, we've talked about the CEOs, we've talked about the role of, let's say, G7 or G20. What role do developing countries play in creating an enabling environment to attract this investment, for instance? What do you...
No, I think it's essential, but here again, we should not fool ourselves. Perception matters. And again, I like to take that example. Usually, I ask people, what are the countries where you would put your money and saying it's going to be safe, there is no change, it's very stable, etc. So usually people, I will save time, they say Singapore, Switzerland, and Norway. Rightly or wrongly. Sorry for Canada, sorry for Sweden.
Sweden and Canada.
No, well, for some reasons they come with Singapore. I mean, it's perception matters. And it's interesting because for those of you who are familiar with that, Norway a few years ago made a big PPP on gas distribution. And then they changed the tariffs. But because it's Norway, I mean, of course, they're being sued by a number of people, but they don't really mention that because it's Norway and it's a rich country, etc. If Senegal or Colombia had done the same, it would, this emerging market, you can't trust them. So, but that is a fact. Perception matters. So that's why I think the development institutions have a very important role. For instance, one of the, and again, I don't think we are there yet, why are the track records of the IFC and others not made public? That would help people to see, hey, look at that. Another point which I've tried to push, these institutions, again, when you add together all the financial commitments from the IMF, the World Bank, EIB, etc., year in, year out, 120, 160 billion. Okay, it's a lot of money, but compared to the needs, it's pretty small. So my point is that these institutions should be really, by construction, forced by their governors, be mobilizing institutions instead of financing institutions. But human nature is such that people want to put their flag. This is my project, my thing. So the idea to work as a system of development institutions, and as a system to mobilize, to put as a priority to mobilize private sector money, that should be the heart. So there are certain things that cannot be financed without concessional money, without philanthropy. Okay, that's where you should concentrate your resources. For the rest, that's what I'm trying to do with the Inter-American Development Bank. So my fund is operating in second commercial page, sorry. My fund is operating in Latin America. We have a working agreement with Inter-American Development Bank. They don't provide any guarantee, anything. We are working together. We work with them on the ground. We've made 2 different investment committees. We co-finance, and we join forces. And when I use them, I pay them. And it's totally transparent. So again, we have to be innovative and try new things. But again, culturally, most of those organizations are still very much, I own what I do, and I want to keep it on my balance sheet as long as possible. Why do you keep these things for 25 years on your balance sheet? You should sell it back to the private sector. I know all the arguments against that, but none is unsurmountable. So we should really shake the system. We've put a lot of money in that system, a lot of money. We could do way more with the same amount of money. Let me take, if I can take a real example. And sorry, I'm going to be very provocative and with all due respect for the World Bank, which I still love and cherish. When I joined the World Bank, and I really had the support of your Canadian ED, the 2 I had at that time. So I say, well, all these development banks have the same shareholders in different proportion, but still Canada is a shareholder of all of them, and France, and the US, and Japan, etc. They have the same objective of eradicating poverty, of promoting prosperity, etc. And all these organizations have a rating. And they all have a AAA rating, which is absolutely essential. Well, we can discuss, but at least in people's minds, it's essential that this system has a AAA. And by construction, if you are the Inter-American Development Bank or the African Development Bank, you are concentrated in a limited number of countries. So your diversification is low, which is weighing on your rating. That's the biggest impediment to the AAA rating, because you are too concentrated. So I suggested that you could spread the risk in the system. That basically, each banks kind of counter-guarantee each banks, so that basically the risk is spread on a bigger basis. And people say, oh, you can't do that. I say, why? Yeah, because legally it's impossible that the African bank is exposed to Brazil. Say, well, you can ask the general counsel. 6 months later, they came back and said, yeah, it's okay, as long as it's not lending to Brazil, but basically guaranteeing the Brazilian risk of IDB. It's a risk management tool. It's okay. Then people say, well, from an accounting perspective, it's bad because you use derivatives. I say, well, I mean, I've used derivatives when I was a CFO of private banks. I mean, you have ways to mitigate the volatility. I mean, it's called, financial guarantee structure. So basically, they move, assets and liabilities move in the same direction, and so basically neutralize the impact. So, of course, the Big Four came back and said, yeah, it's okay. And then the third argument said, you will not get any credit from S&P. I said, well, let's ask them. So we checked with S&P rating advisory services and said, yes, of course. If the risk is better spread, we give you the credit. Okay, then we move to the next step, and I put together a first transaction between the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank, where basically we're spreading, exchanging through derivatives a number of positions. And the net benefit was, at no cost for the shareholder, $23 billion additional capacity, $23 billion additional capacity spread into the system. Of course, it was disproportionately beneficiary to the African Development Bank, a little less to the Inter-American, and of course, because the World Bank was more diversified by nature, a little less for the World Bank. But everybody was better off. To make a long story short, we had the final meetings, etc., and there were still reluctance in the room. And the reluctance, first of all, were, oh, you give more to our competitors. I say, okay, well, it's not a good argument. You're better off anyway, so maybe the others are better off than you are, but it's still okay.
Not to mention they're not really competitors. But.
Yeah, and that's my second point. I mean, you cannot go to the G20 and say we have a $1 trillion financing gap, and then I bring 23, which is still a drop in the bucket, and you don't want it. But the real issue is that, well, but you know, Bertrand, you are helping our competitors, and the problem is that our competitors are worse than we are. So maybe you are giving money to bad people. And they will basically take the good projects from us because you give them resources. So I don't want to say it's general comments, but you still have this feeling that people are competing, that people don't really respect each other, etc. So I think we have to force, and that's coming back to the G20. The G20 has the control of each of these institutions. So if the G20 was playing his role as majority shareholder and say, instruct these people, and every year at every G7, G20 meeting, you say the first chapter on the agenda is, where do we stand in financing the SDG? What did the organization we control do? That might be a change. That might be a signal.
I think it's a great suggestion.
But we are not there.
But we can be there. And that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that we're actually able to do. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Let's bring it down before I open it up to the floor, because I want us to have more of a dialogue in the room. Let's bring it down to an individual level, and I am going to still poke you to come back about what developing countries can do to attract investment. But let's talk about individuals. You know, we've been very much at the systems level so far. One of the things that we're particularly preoccupied with is how do we close the gender gap in our investments. And as we're moving into this space where we're talking about innovative finance, how do we make sure that it's actually also going to lead to more financial inclusion? So from your perspective, how can we leverage this new opening, this new conversation about additionality, focus on sustainable development, achieving the goals? How do we also leverage this to address the gender gap in financial
I think it's fundamental.
Inclusion?
As was said before, you have roughly, I mean, again, more or less 2 billion people which are not, which have no access to finance, and probably more than 50% of these 2 million are women. And it's a mix of different things. Again, and I think what you do at the Toronto Centre is absolutely crucial. There is a supervision element into that. And I think good progress has been made over the past 10 years. The problem is that, again, I don't think there's maybe RDC is the only country left where a woman needs an authorization of her husband to open a banking account. So we are getting there. But there are more subtle things, like can a woman have her own idea for the KYC, for instance? You know, this type of tricky questions, which are not totally connected to the direct supervision, but which are connected to the way the things are operating, etc. So you have to dig into the country by country. What are the regulatory impediments, the cultural impediments, the social impediments, etc. But it's absolutely crucial because it's been amply demonstrated that financial inclusion per se is good, and in particular with women, it makes a big difference. But it's a challenging one. Because it's again, if you go to the Middle East, for instance, and in some regions, all this is pretty subtle. It's okay, but it's not happening for a number of reasons that we know. So that's really where I think what you do at the Toronto Centre is essential. Take case by case. It's not a general question. Let's help women. You really have to go country by country.
Investment by investment. No,
and also make sure that, and that's what I'm trying to do with my fund, make sure that whenever you mobilize money, whether you're a bank, a fund, etc., you force this. You know, one of the things I'm trying to do, part of my activity is to provide capital to mid-sized banks, is to make sure they have a gender-based approach. And actually, the truth is that when you work on that, I mean, as is very well known, I mean, women are relatively better than men at lending money. So it's not such a bad deal. So it's important to remind people of that, but it's not enough.
I mean, it's certainly ensuring that they have access to capital and leadership and assets, but also making sure that investments are being done in sectors that matter to women and girls as well, which is a different kind of conversation than we normally have. And this is something I would just say, a plug for what the DFIs have done. So in the lead up to Charlevoix, the DFIs led by the Canadian and French DFIs came together and did the 2X challenge. And they essentially said, we're going to try to leverage up to $3 billion over the course of the next 5 years, specifically around women's economic empowerment and women entrepreneurship. So now we'll see with them as the key lenders whether or not they can incentivize the system to address those sectors and to address some of the issues within countries where there are barriers to women's access. Okay, let's have a discussion. Yes, sir. Introduce yourself and...
My name is John Palmer. I'm with the Toronto Centre. This is a frustrating conversation. I mean, you're both...
I'm sorry.
You're both very frustrated.
But I'm an optimistic, frustrated person, whereas Bertrand...
No.
You've got, I mean, something should be happening here. You've got willing public sector bodies that are prepared to provide guarantees. I can tell you from my private sector work that there is a demand for product. You know, prices for good infrastructure projects are going up because there is too little product and there's too much demand. And so there's a gap that needs to be filled. And these sorts of projects that we're talking about, supported by government guarantees, ought to be filling that gap, and yet it's not happening. And I'm not hearing enough specifics about why it's not happening. I'm hearing regulation, and I can understand that, being an ex-regulator, and I know that our regulator in Canada doesn't like alternative assets. And one of the organizations that I'm involved with is having to divest alternative assets rather than loading up on them as we would prefer to do, because they are very good investments and they have much better returns than fixed income investments. So that's, work has to be, there's missionary work to be done with the regulators, and there are structures that need to be created that meet the regulators' concerns about risk. And but there must be other issues as well. Is it, I guess I'm hearing maybe lack of will, maybe lack of familiarity. Are there other specific objections or concerns, Bertrand, that you've run into, or Elissa, that you've run into when you've been talking, Elissa, to, I guess, CPPIB and some of the big Canadian pools
teachers,
of capital.
Caisse
so
de dépôt,
they must be giving you some specific reasons why they're not leaping into this particular void. I'd like to hear some specifics, and I guess if I can ask a second question, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. You know, are there any templates? You know, have we seen any deals? Because I think the more deals we see, the easier it's going to be to sell this and to get people moving into this space.
Two great questions. Let's take maybe one or two more, and then we'll have a group
With
of them.
jet lag, I will make note because I have good memory.
Besoin
But,
de stylo?
non,
No,
c'est bon,
ça
c'est
va?
bon.
Okay. Hard to see in the room. Follow-on question? Come on. I've got staff in the room who I know are itching to ask questions. Yes, sir. I see hand, but not face, so you're going to have to help me out.
Thank you. My name is François-Philippe Dubé. I work for Global Affairs Canada. So you're talking about the need to increase increase finance for the SDGs by 3 orders of magnitude. My concern is a little bit different. I'd like to hear you more about financial inclusion, because for a long time, especially in the 90s, for example, onwards, when the big movement towards microcredit started, and especially we donors, were really interested in this thesis of helping people, and especially women, get more access to productive capital. And then studies came in at some point showing that, well, credit is ultimately credit. Some ventures succeed, some fail. Some people manage to get richer, but at the same time, many others go bankrupt or will have problems. So anyway, the point is, it turns out that credit is not necessarily the best financial tool to help the poor escape poverty. Now, what we know is that savings and insurance, in some contexts, manage to increase the resilience of the poor and are a good way to help support poverty reduction. Now, we don't see a lot of drive to increase the drive towards the resilience of the poor, financial and otherwise. And I'd like to hear you talk about how we donors can help stimulate that kind of market. Thank you.
Fair enough. Bertrand, veux-tu commencer? Ou est-ce qu'on aimerait prendre troisième?
And you mentioned all the resistance that you face trying to kick off the exposure exchanges with the World Bank and its partners.
Well, you know the technical terms, so you're an insider.
I try to be. So there's a lot of interest with the G20 with respect to securitization, and if you could walk us through this kind of path of resistance that an instrument like that would face within the institutions, for example, with the various risk committees, the legal aspects, and the perspective from the credit rating agencies, I think it would be really useful.
Great.
Okay. So your question, so obstacles are different. I don't want to overload regulation. I think it's only part of the equation. It's a good excuse for not addressing the cultural issues, which quite often are important. Sometimes also the results of regulation. I mean, when when I mentioned the accounting principles, at the end of the day, you're immersed in these accounting principles. You don't pay attention anymore, but they really form the way of thinking. So who is responsible? I don't know. At the end of the day, both work together. But as I mentioned, I think the relative weight I'd like to take the example. When I was at Crédit Agricole, so I was a group CFO of Crédit Agricole in 2007, and we were searching for head of compliance. And nobody wanted to do that job. It was supposed to be the cemetery. I mean, why do you want to punish me? Now it's one of the most in-demand jobs. And same for the chief risk officer. Chief risk officer was okay, but still, now these two functions, again, for good reasons, because of the crisis, have been elevated in the decision-making process. And they have an influence, a real or supposed one, where people just don't want even to enter into conversation with these people. Okay, Bertrand, this is great, but listen, I mean, no, I don't want to spend 3 months to convince these people, etc. I have better things to do. So that's really what I say. So unless you have a CEO, like some of the one you mentioned, say, I want this to happen, the system will not push in that direction. Unfortunately, it's as simple as that. So it's not the fact that it is badly intentioned. I think nobody is badly intentioned. It's a system that works like this. And at the end of the day, it provides a good excuse for everybody not to do. And that's really for me. After having met like 200 investors for my fund, that's what I've seen. When it doesn't work, at the end of the day, it's usually around these type of things.
So I think-
why should I bother?
And one of the things that I would say we're seeing is it's also about how a lack of the deals, so the pipeline itself, and then the nature of the pipeline, and that countries have difficulties structuring the deals, right? So that was partly why Canada helped to create convergence. It was precisely to try to provide supports to those governments and other potential investors to say, okay, well, this is how these deals might be structured. Here are the things that you need to be able to think about. So I think many of you know Marc-André Blanchard, who's our ambassador to the UN in New York. We've created this Friends of Sustainable Development Financing that we co-chair with Jamaica precisely to try to get at some of these questions. And one of the things that the Friends group is doing, because we just didn't want it to be a talk shop, is to they've piloted with a number of developing country partners and said, okay, what are the big deals that you want resources for? And they've pulled them offline. They've given them training and supports from a number of big institutional investors to say, this is what we look for when we're thinking about investing in a deal. This is how you have to talk to us. Here's how you do your elevator pitch. Here's the due diligence that we would expect to have been done prior to us being willing to make an investment. And that's actually we're starting to see traction with that. So it's as simple as whether or not the pipeline exists, whether or not they know whether these countries know how to structure the deals, whether we're communicating effectively that we're willing to de-risk, and what are the tools that we're bringing to the table. So some of this is just, it's about whether or not we're actually offering up those things that need to be done. And then you marry that with whether or not, on the private sector side, those CEOs and organizations are incentivized to provide the capital as well. And then there's the perception issue that we need to be able to tackle, which again is this issue of a heightened perception of operating in certain environments where they think that there's a greater risk than there likely is. You can operate in Senegal, you can operate in Botswana, you can operate in Ghana. There are all kinds of places where it is viable to make investments with private capital money.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think what you say is true for infrastructure.
That's what
and infrastructure is only part of the equation.
Yeah.
I mean, you have.
That's fair.
I mean, yeah, it's not only infrastructure. I mean, in most of these countries, you have banks. I mean, Société Générale, where I was the CFO, has a huge African network. But the truth is that you're financing the state-owned companies, whatever calls them oligarch or whatever, the companies at the top, but you don't go deep into the country. And the type of project I'm seeing in Latin America, interestingly, we are financing companies which are not for the microfinance, microcredit, microinsurance, micro, etc., but which are not big enough to get access to the system. So these companies are family-owned. They don't know how to grow, actually. And that's where it's not about being bankable. It's about reaching out to them, etc.
Yeah, fair enough.
So that's why I think it's very important to help. I used to say when I was at the World Bank, when you discuss development, people immediately think physical infrastructure, then second, health education, and then sometimes financial infrastructure. And that comes to your point. I think it's very important, and that's why also the Toronto Centre has a particular responsibility to develop in every country a system where you can lend, save, or get insured at reasonable cost. That's really, I had this conversation with Tidjane Thiam when he was at Prudential, and he explained me when they started, one of their big success was a product in Indonesia where people could save like $3 or $4 per month. And over 20 years, when you have millions and millions of Indonesians putting $5 per month, I mean, you control 25% of Jakarta Stock Exchange. So I don't know whether it was a little bit of commercial presentation on his side, but that's my point. Instead of putting your money under your mattress, to put your money at play in the system. I think it's very important that these organizations, what you do, etc., move in that direction. And in particular, I take your point on insurance. I mean, one of the issues in most developing countries is to face shocks, being a natural catastrophe, a civil war, pandemics, or whatever. I mean, insurance has been created to face that. So maybe a way to help people to subsidize the subscription by this bit of insurance product would have a way more positive effect than just giving them money. So we have to think about this, but really creating the financial infrastructure that, I mean, was created in Europe, Canada, or the US in the 19th century is absolutely essential. And that is what is missing. Again, I'm very happy that SocGen has a great African network in Africa, but it's not really addressing the needs of deep in the society.
I mean, and this might be also where some of the institutions that the development community has traditionally worked with who are more comfortable in that space. I'm thinking of a Desjardins, for instance, that does
Or the Crédit Agricole. I mean, Crédit Agricole started as a system
Kenya.
where people in the French Jura, the Swiss border, wanted to put together their cows and put money to basically, and 100 years later, it was $2 trillion, starting with 1 cow or 2 cows in Jura.
Yeah.
So, again, there were particular circumstances. But that's, so the last question on the exposure exchange agreement, which is the real name of the risk-sharing mechanism, I'm a little frustrated because after this first transaction, nothing happened. And again, I'm pretty sure there is potential by putting more people in the system, not just Africa, Latin America, and the World Bank, but the Asian Development Bank is not really interested. EIB, COR. But if you could mix a little bit of German credit with a little bit of Bolivian credit, that might be an interesting combination, etc. So I think, again, I don't want to say what I put together is a panacea, but I think we have to work in that direction. And my secret idea behind this exchange mechanism was that if people start to exchange their risk, they will start to analyze the risk in the same manner, which basically will change the standards from above and force people to consider things the same and will make the work together easier on the ground instead of having everybody having his own little system to analyze the risk, etc., etc. So again, I think we have to work more and more as a system. And that's why, coming back to the point, the G7 and G20 have a particular responsibility because they are the shareholders. And again, we were discussing before the meeting, when I left the World Bank, I was interviewed by the board, and they say, so what do you think? And vis-à-vis the board, and I say, well, you spend too much time on things of little value. In particular, every transaction is being reviewed by the board. And so I've chaired the board many times, and I don't know, Andrew is in the room. And so people say, yes, you should do a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, etc. Okay, that's great. But you should spend more time on this type of thing, on the strategy, the way you work together, etc. That would be very valuable instead of trying to fine-tune every transaction. So it's really, for me, the next. If we want to revive multilateralism, we have to make it work better. And that's probably a way. If you can demonstrate that this system is really delivering something at a reasonable cost, which we can discuss that point as well, that will make a difference.
Bon, peut-être que ça, c'est le bon moment de terminer notre conversation. Merci infiniment, Bertrand. Non, mais moi, je vais terminer d'une note positive.
Ah, OK.
No, I mean, I think Bertrand, what I love about Bertrand, and have always loved about him, is it's an unvarnished honesty and reflection of what needs to be done. And so, if anything, I think that you've identified a series of to-dos for us, and it's important for us to have you now on the outside poking at the system to say, you said you were going to do this, and we're still waiting to see how you're going to deliver on X, Y, and Z, and here are suggestions on how I think you can do it. And your cri de coeur, that we can make the system work better, that we have this opportunity at this moment in time, that we need to seize upon it, I think is absolutely right. We need to be reminded that, you know, we're already 3, almost 4 years in to Agenda 2030. We have a scant 11 and a half years before we really have the bill that says whether or not we were able to deliver. We need to be getting our heads around these things, and there's different colleagues in the room that have different levers that can be pulled. So I think that you've exactly set the right tone and message for us, which is to get on with it. Et donc, merci infiniment, Bertrand.
Je n'ai même pas parlé français, c'est terrible.
And thank you very much, colleagues. I hope this discussion can continue and take it in the spirit that Bertrand has established, which is one that is provocative, but aimed at ultimately being solutions-oriented. Donc, merci.
Merci, Elissa.
Yeah, merci, Bertrand and Elissa. That was a very fascinating conversation. And Elissa, I really liked your opening remarks, and it was pretty provocative. Thanks. At this point, I'd like to save the best for last. Ask our Vice Chair, Maureen Jensen, to come and thank the speakers and offer brief closing remarks. Maureen is the chair of the Ontario Securities Commission, the most senior securities regulator in Canada. Am I allowed to say that in such a way? And also she is a member of the IOSCO Board of Directors and also a very strong supporter of the various topics that we've been talking about. So,
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. So, did you determine, can finance save the world?
Yes, if.
If, yeah. So I think your vision to regain the power of money to serve the needs of the common good is a compelling read. I mentioned to you when you walked in that I did read it yesterday, and it was a lot to consume in a short period of time. But it was, I have to say, your conversation this evening was very interesting and quite provocative. So given the scope of the challenges and the responses that we just heard, it seems clear that all market players, including banking systems, capital market participants, insurance firms, pension funds, we must all work towards a common goal. And I just took a few notes, and the takeaway for me here is definitely part of the friction in this system is cultural. I think there's no question that it's difficult for people to move. The system is very much focused on short-term assessment and short-term gains and not on long-term benefits. And this is an ecosystem. I think the incentives need to be completely realigned because we as regulators really do look at de-risking the system on this short term, whether it's quarterly or whether it's yearly. And yet it's the only time we're going to make the appropriate gains is when we take risks for the long term. And I think that is the friction that's causing the slowness of change. So I think our guest clearly articulated that we can either be enablers of this change or we can be blockers. And we can really impact financial stability, financial inclusion, gender equality, climate change, and clean economic growth. I think you've challenged all of us to consider being enablers rather than blockers for the system. So many of the people in this room will be at the forefront of this debate over the coming years. You have been at the table and you will continue to be. And we'll be looking to set a course for stable and purpose-driven financial system that meets all of our needs. So I suggest to you today, humbly, that the work of the Toronto Centre would be a useful tool to help us become enablers. And it is uniquely positioned to do this. The Centre is unique among the capacity-building organizations that work globally across sectors, in banking, in securities, insurance, and in pensions. And if governments wish to work together to deliver a common view of economic success and building for the future, the greatest impact will be achieved when authorities for the entire sector work together and realign the cultural goals. So the Centre has long-standing relationships with regional groupings of financial authorities around the globe, and you've heard this not only in our video, but in some of the discussions today. So I think it can leverage that network to raise awareness and plants the seed of actions across a range of countries simultaneously. So we have many tools beyond the core education programs, and these include webcasts, executive panels, semi-annual meetings of the World Bank, the IMF, and the Toronto Centre notes. And we already have a body of work related to the topics that we discussed today. Currently, we are ramping up the engagement on environmental issues and environmental focus. We've developed a program to increase awareness among our clients of environmental issues that are completely relevant to financial systems and financial stability. The Centre is also exploring innovative ways to raise awareness about the importance of closing the gender gap in finance and using digital finance as an enabling tool. So in summary, I think you can see that the Toronto Centre could be an active player in promoting your focus and in educating some of the areas of concern that we have discussed tonight. I want to thank you all that have joined us here today and for engaging in a very important topic that we need to discuss as people who are core to the financial system. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Government of Canada for its stalwart support of the Toronto Centre since 1998, and the continued support from our other core funders, the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency and the IMF. So as a regulator who is involved in IOSCO, I can say that the programs from the Toronto Centre make a difference. I hear that from my fellow regulators around the board table. And we do that by ensuring that we have a common understanding of the goals of regulation, the risks that we are trying to ensure our market participants do not take, or at least take carefully, and in the delivery of programs that support effective regulation. So thank you to all of our supporters, from all of us at the Toronto Centre, and from those who use the programs to improve their skills to address the current issues in the markets. Thank you once again to our speaker and our moderator, and thank you very, very much. Good night. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you to our moderators and our guest speakers. And that concludes our Fireside Chat for this evening. Merci à tout le monde d'avoir assisté à notre causerie au coin du feu ce soir. Merci de vous être rejoints à nous et j'espère que ça a été une conversation, une discussion stimulante pour vous. So please, on the way out, do not, if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to take a special 20th anniversary gift bag from the Toronto Centre. So thank you. Bonne fin de soirée.